Well, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for making the time to be here today in our innovation conversation. It's a series of talks we've had for the last many months, a couple of years, and I'm glad to see the room is so full. Obviously, a testament to the topic today, which is one of the most exciting initiatives that are happening in UNDP. It's going to be a learning opportunity. We have a number of people connected online. I want to say hello to them as well. We thought we would broadcast this invite internally to UNDP, so it's a cozier crowd, if you will. I think it's important we have a good understanding within UNDP of what the initiative around the Accelerator Labs aims to do and how we can all contribute and tune into those that kind of vision. So I'm very pleased to welcome Gina Lucarelli, who is leading that work out of the executive office. And the folks on her team are, of course, Millie, that some of you may know from part of these conversations, and certainly a well-known face in the English community in UNDP, as well as Carl and Bas as well, who are, I understand, consulting and helping. Good to see you too, JD, as well. I know you're also behind it in terms of the overall strategic input. So without further ado, I would ask Gina to take us through this, and it's very informal, as you know. We'll have some questions, no doubt. I'll probably go to our colleagues online to get their questions first, and then we'll open it up to the colleagues in the room. Thanks very much again.
Great. Sounds great. Fantastic. So, wow, speaking of meta. So thank you guys so much. I was just joking with Ben and Jeff that the best way to invite participation is to present something imperfect. So that is exactly what we're doing here. This is the beginning of a conversation. This is just getting started. And we're really looking to all of you to inform it, be part of it, dial it up, improve it, all of those things. So really an invitation to help us here. So we have a little bit of the startup team. Maybe we'll just go to the next. So there's something. Or you just. So we're going to do this presentation a little bit as a tag team effort between Millie, Cal, Bas, and I as the startup team here. So this is basically what we'll cover today. We're going to talk about the Accelerator Lab network, sort of what it is and where it came from, specifically how we think this is going to tackle the question of strategic relevance, and then a little bit into some of the thinking on the how that these Accelerator Labs will use in 60 countries and as a network. So that is largely it. So let me just hand over to Millie to take us through this innovation journey in UNDP.
So what we wanted to do is set the initiative into a bit of a historical context, right? So it's a very busy graph, but it basically shows the journey of the innovation work in UNDP from 2012 to 2017, right? So initially, cool kids in the block, not really knowing what we're doing, flying under the radar, trying to do development differently in a way that we can quickly show results and then use those to build a little bit of political capital and investment in order to position UNDP better with the governments, right? So within a year to 2 years, we start seeing a couple of country offices globally who are starting to get some early results, starting to get a little bit of a flash and a different flavor of what UNDP does. And then we have a number of other offices, again, globally picking this up. At which point in time, colleagues, especially here in New York, started sort of advising on, okay, so we need to get a little bit more serious. We need to start turning what we're doing into a bit of a service offering, and start thinking through how does this agenda play into the broader strategic direction of UNDP, leading us onward to about 2016-17, where you have positions within fixed-term staff that has innovation titles in it. We have an innovation facility out of New York that's corporately supporting this agenda. And we have the arrival of the new administration in 2017. Thank you, 2017. Now, what happened at that point in time, if I were to reflect on the 2012-2017, we've had a lot of new things coming out of this agenda, showing that we can have a very new service offering for our clients, mobilizing funding from very different sources, going beyond traditional donors, building different set of skills both for our staff and for public sector. But essentially, all of those new things didn't really change the way that we do business. They didn't really land within the new way of doing business. So with the arrival of the new administration, one of the things that we're seeing is a lot more strategic and coherent view on this whole innovation agenda, where you see a number of initiatives, almost a number of startups being run that are aiming to address two big things. One, change the type of demand that we're getting from the governments. So you have Project Catalyst, you have SDG Impact, you have a series of innovation days, Next Gen Gov out of Istanbul, Inclusive Economy 4.0 out of Bangkok, trying to generate very different type of discussion with governments, right? So this is one. And then a set of initiatives that are aiming to change the supply, the way we do business, right? There isn't really a clear-cut division between the two, but roughly here you have platform work and you have Accelerator Lab network. Yeah. So this is just to give a bit of a context how this all comes together. So if we, and this is literally a slide that we produced half an hour ago. So really testing it out with your 30-second elevator pitch. So the rationale for the initiative is that this pace of change outside outpaces the change on the inside, both for UNDP and development partners in our governments. So in order to stay relevant, we need to accelerate the pace of learning that we have. And 60 labs are the first cohort. And again, the administrator was very clear that this is a capability that we as an organization would have across the board. The labs are supposed to test, not develop, but test. Basically means that we don't have it all figured out yet, but we will. New ways of working to address frontier challenges, right? So if you look at this part here, what this means is country offices really drive the action. Learning is network and adapted, and learning is really the result that we want to get out of this. So moving away from purely delivery mode and being accountability driven to primarily learning. I'll go to the next one. So we have 60 labs cohort. This is just a breakdown to give you a sense of by regions and by income. And this is our little pretty map as to where they are. Now, if we were to put together two big sets of questions that the labs are supposed to answer, this is around, we see governments being faced with a lot of things they haven't had to deal with before. So how do we help them learn fast about what they are, what are their implications, and how to address them? And how do we move beyond things that we know don't work, right? How do we move beyond sort of incremental single point solutions to initiative? And if we're able to crack this, we're solving for this question of relevance, right? We become more relevant to our clients. Now, what do we actually mean by that question of relevance, right? So just talking through a couple of examples. This was a New York Times article that came out 2 weeks ago, right? Where we learned that Facebook has around 7,000 people on their staff who are mandated to police freedom of speech, right? So inflammatory language, hate speech is something that we have been dealing with for decades. But now you have this private sector partner who has 7,000 staff who roughly have 3 to 4 seconds to look at the content on Facebook and decide whether this is hate speech or not. Right? 3 to 4 seconds, just let that sink in. And on the basis of what they do, now we have evidence that their choices have led to acceleration of violence across a number of different countries. They have an influence on the electoral, we're in the US, so we know what is the case here, but also across the world. So if you look at this and compare it to a governance portfolio of a country office, do we have anything in our governance portfolio that speaks to this, right? And if we don't, the question is, to what extent are we relevant to our clients? End of November, beginning of December, the story about the first genetically engineered baby in China, right? So the question becomes, what does ethics look like in the world where we have some of humans being genetically engineered? What are the questions of fairness? What are the questions of human rights? What happens when the genetically engineered baby competes with my child for a job or for an entry into the university, right? What do we have in our portfolio that speaks to that? We're a norm-based organization, right? Do we have anything in our portfolio right now that speaks to this? Air pollution, again, an issue that we have been dealing with for decades. But today, with the progress of science, we're able to understand better the implications of air pollution. So we know that there's a direct link between air pollution and diabetes. We know that air pollution strips roughly a year of university education in places like China, like Sarajevo and Skopje. That it penetrates mother's placenta, so when the baby is born, it's already starting 5 steps behind. Right? So if you take our GF portfolio, which is mainly the area of work that deals with these types of issues, how do you log frame this? Right? How do you develop a project that deals with this? Last one. This graph probably is the best justification why half of our labs are in Africa. Right? This is the World Bank projection on the number of people living in extreme poverty for the rest of the world, and then for Africa. Right? The quote here is the quote from the evaluation of the UNDP's portfolio in poverty that came out November, December last year. Right? So lots of good stuff that we do, but where we need work is to address multidimensionality and complexity of poverty interventions, leading to systemic change, leading to that green graph to go down. We're not there yet, which means we have a relevance gap, right? So what all of these and a number of other examples are showing is that these risks that are happening outside are happening at such speed and scale that challenge what we currently have, right? And that leads to the relevance gap, not just impacting member states' capability to deal with them, which is an external bit, but also our own internal ability to help them deal with them, right? And the scary part is that it's an exponential growth, right? So this is kind of a meta framing as to where we would like Accelerator Labs to play, which is right here. Now, in designing the initiative, we studied hard things that we know don't work, right? We may not have all the answers to what will work, but we know what doesn't work, right? So sitting in a plush 5-star hotel with 100 people designing our CPD once every 5 years, we know that that doesn't work. It's painting us into a world that's not going to be there 5 years from now. A training, a startup, a unicorn, more data, right? These single point solutions, processes that get us the funnel from many pilots into one that we then scale. Doesn't work in evolution. Little baby 20 years from now is not a big baby. It doesn't work in development. We've also studied labs, both inside UNDP and outside. And there are a couple of things that we've picked up on that don't really work. A lot of these units were premised on building lots of new things, ad hoc experiments to prove their worth, and then generate political space and political capital into them. A lot of them have become delivery units. In other words, delivering on the current agenda and not necessarily questioning the assumptions of whether we are asking the right questions. Again, going back to the relevance question. Many of them were not close to the center of power, so when the new administrations come, they go into they become obsolete. This is very important for RGPN, right? We see that there is a very weak integration between substantive experts in different policy areas and social innovation experts. And both lose. In this context, both of them lose. And lastly, there isn't really a network connecting these labs. So essentially what UNDP is building here is the world's largest network of structures that are supposed to accelerate learning and bring up new solutions for SDGs and these complex challenges. All right. So if we put all of this together, I'll hand it over to you.
Yep, that's good. Yeah, thanks. So what is the relevance gap? If we're going to kind of summarize it, one is pilots are actually a slow way of learning about whether our solutions are working or not. It takes a year or more to kind of find out whether something is working. There's a lot of pursuit of kind of these single point solutions like Millie was talking about. We'll pick one approach, we'll pilot it, and then 1 or 2 years later, we find out whether it works, and then we take action on that information. In many cases, there's an importing of best practices, but best practices often lag behind the actual problems that they're designed to solve. So in many cases, we'll have pulled out something from academic research, but that problem will already have shifted. Another big challenge is offices kind of working in isolation, relearning things that other offices have already learned, right? So the solutions that we're kind of offering aren't necessarily as relevant because of that. And last but not least, if we keep looking at the same data, we keep getting the same answers, right? If we keep going back to national surveys and national statistics and things like that, we won't necessarily be able to find some of these new approaches. So where do we want to shift to? Well, one is, and how do the labs kind of address this relevance gap? One is faster learning through experimentation. So how do we take that learning cycle from 1 to 2 years down to a few weeks or a few months using experimental approaches? Two is to build portfolios of multiple solutions. So instead of trying solutions in serial, we're trying multiple solutions in parallel and seeing, what is working, what's not, where should we kind of double down our investments. Three is, instead of kind of importing these best practices, to learn from the solutions that people already have kind of developed in these local contexts, right? So any place where state services have failed or where there are gaps, people have developed their own workarounds and ways of doing that. Can we be inspired by those and build on those? We think that if we do that, those solutions are more likely to stick. Instead of kind of working in isolation, the 60 labs are designed to work as an integrated learning network, right? So if a lab on one side learns something, the other labs need to be able to build on that knowledge and use it as soon as possible. So really to design something from a cultural standpoint, from a set of work practices that operates like an integrated learning network. And then last but not least, the labs serve to kind of bring in new sources of data, big data, qualitative data that allow us to find new patterns and new approaches to addressing these challenges. Now, it's not to say that we're all on this side. These are all spectrums, right? And we lie in different points in these spectrums. But the labs are trying to kind of move us, and they adopt approaches that are designed to get us to this sort of side of the spectrum.
So if that was the historical context as to where this initiative fits and what is the question that we're trying to solve, over to Gina on how we're actually proposing that the labs will address the relevance gap.
I better stand up, otherwise these young people make me look old. So just to say, first of all, we've been in heavy contact with all 60 country offices, both before the new year and now starting into January. Much of this is going to be led by them. The issues on which the Accelerator Labs work are determined at the country office level. So this is definitely from the bottom up. However, we're trying to frame sort of some of the how, they're referred to as protocols in the concept note that you might have seen, to see what are the sort of approaches that can address this relevance gap, depending on what issue the country office chooses. So these are the three, the way that we're calling them so far as of today. What is it? January 23rd. So first we talk about solutions mapping, we talk about collective intelligence, and we talk about managing a portfolio of experiments. So just to go through these then kind of one by one. By solutions mapping, we're talking about accelerating the impact of development by finding people who are solving their own problems. They're not waiting for the market. They're not waiting for the government to solve it for them, right? So the examples that you have here are this fellow, right, who invented his own tractor, right, because it couldn't make the sharp turns enough to do the work it needed to do. It got picked up by Pramal Pharmatics, and he got a patent for it, and he took that up. But he just invented it himself because he just needed to do his own farming. He had no interest in scaling it, actually. It was only just how it developed from there. You have other examples like the farmers in Bangladesh whose farms get flooded so often that they just figured, why don't they just float, right? Why don't we just make them so that they can actually be resilient enough to move and go with the flow, but have enough control to know where the crops are when we need them. This is sort of a solution that we want to pick up our head from our projects and our programs and our delivery and look and see and have the humility to learn from and think, how can we help scale that? And then thirdly, in a very different context, sorry for cutting off the top of Dana's head here. This is a woman named Dana Lewis who has type 1 diabetes, and she's a heavy sleeper. She's also an engineer. So her problem was her iPhone glucose monitor, the alarm wasn't loud enough. So she was like, okay, well, let me just sort this out. I'll just hack that, so that wakes me up in the middle of the night. I'm single, I live alone, my glucose goes down, I could die. So she fixed that. She put it, open source, shared it with the world. Then she went a bit further to try and connect her insulin pump to her glucose monitor. She basically invented this whole thing. She can't get it regulated because she's not registered. This is a US example. She's not registered as a company. She has no interest. She just wants people with type 1 diabetes to be able to sleep through the night in the way she does. So again, the market isn't for some reason not solving this problem fast enough. So her hashtag is #we're not waiting. And I follow her on Twitter. This is, she sort of tweets every time her artificial pancreas goes through an airport. She's like, made it through another airport, with my artificial pancreas. We're actually going to have her talk at the Solutions Mapping webinar next Thursday at 8 a.m. New York time with the Accelerator Lab network. So the question is, it's more than anecdotal, right? We're not saying how quaint, look at Dana, right? We're saying, what are we missing, right? What is the ingenuity that's there that our policy-oriented, systems-targeted approaches are just completely missing, right? So this is the idea behind solutions mapping. When it comes to a portfolio experiments, essentially here, this is where we're talking about a completely different kind of strategy, where the strategy is not to sort of as venture capital does, have many approaches, funnel it down to the rest of it. As Millie and Cal said, that doesn't work. I mean, maybe we just lose attention and we don't, go from pilot to scale. I don't know what it is, or maybe it's just that's not how the world works. We're not running factories. Maybe that's why. I don't know, but whatever it is, it doesn't work. So we're looking at maintaining multiple experiments in a portfolio and keeping our options open for a while, especially for the frontier challenges that we're talking about that we frankly don't have solutions for, right? So we need to keep our strategic options open, and the learning in that space is the outcome. Lastly, so this is, a good quote about thinking of strategy, not so much as, a good strategy closes a few doors kind of thing, but rather holding in it a portfolio of experiments, right? Holding in it a series of options. This is definitely an approach that's used both in Finland and Chile, this portfolio of experiments approach. So lastly, collective intelligence. So here we're looking at mimicking and then amplifying the functions of a brain with people working together and machines, right? That's basically what it is, for better design, delivery, and monitoring of public service programs. That's what collective intelligence is. So there are many examples, of course, where we're looking at satellite data to monitor crop productivity and do modeling, et cetera, et cetera. There are many, many more examples of people, citizen scientists, mapping bird species or mapping safety in the cities in Honduras, or mapping, disease surveillance among health workers, et cetera, et cetera. The challenge with collective intelligence work so far has been that it sort of hits a plateau where even as the UN, we, through the My World work and the run up to the Sustainable Development Goals, we proved that crowdsourcing was possible. Whether we can then take that intelligence that comes from the crowd and repeatedly, iteratively, bring it into our work is the question, right? So it happens also a lot with AI or big data work. It's like, look what we did. Who knew that data existed? That's an insight. Pop, pop, pop. Thank you very much. I'm going to go back doing exactly what I was doing before, right? Let alone the point where you can imagine people holding governments and businesses to account by, drone footage over a mining site or something like that. So that's the sort of direction of travel on that. So this is just generally, no need to go into it in detail. The poor country offices are mapping their way through this. Right now, we're recruiting lab teams in 60 countries. I think posts are being opened as we speak. These are NOB level positions, and there are 3 positions: the head of experimentation, head of solutions mapping, and head of exploration. So we'll hire those 3 staff in 60 countries. So we're looking to hire 180 new talent, very, very fast. So just to close on with this serious offer of invitation to help us to be part of this, and to make clear exactly what we're looking for from all of you. So if you can help us respond to the frontier challenges that are coming from the labs. Right now, all the country offices have homework. They got it yesterday, where they are the count is 460, right? They're meant to think through a frontier policy challenge in an area that is just changing so rapidly that their usual tools are not keeping up, right? So we're trying to identify what do those look like, and we'll be coming back with stuff probably that we don't have all of the solutions for. So this we would definitely like help with. As Millie was saying, really let's connect the social innovation expertise to the substantive expertise, the experts in rule of law, in climate change, in gender equality, etc. This is fundamental. Do help us find, you may be among them, the innovators and the innovations that are under the radar, and let's pull this together now as a system, now that we have the senior leadership behind it. And finally, like big emphasis on the last one here, I'm sure Bernardo can relate to this, and all the work that's been done by the practice, is what we're looking for is finding ways to graft what I'm calling innovation exceptions or innovation waivers, right, onto the way we do business. We know, that it's just too hard to work with certain kind of partners, and you end up dropping the ability to do so. So all of this needs to graft back onto the organization. So anyone who has the sort of, persistence and stamina and excitement to do that, we could really use the help. So let's open it up maybe there for questions. We'll go from there.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much to all of you. It was really inspiring, and it was very articulate. And you took us through the journey. I think some of the elements, I think we've all seen in different shapes and forms perhaps in the past. So it's really nice to see it come together into this consolidated offering, which I think it also speaks to the journey around innovation of the organization over the last many years. In fact, I would say the last 10 years or so, maybe 6 to 10 years. And it's really good to see it all come together. I certainly do have a lot of questions, but it's not my place to ask it yet. We'll have the chance as we follow up. If that's okay with you, I'll try and see if there's anyone online who has any burning issues. I see, no, we don't have anyone. In which case, I'd like to open it, to throw it open. This is a really good slide, I think, to start on that. It's an open invitation, I think, to collaborate and to really be part of this exciting journey. We have a really full room, which is great. So I'm going to go over to that end, and we'll take maybe 3 questions, if that's okay, and then you can manage it the way you want. So go ahead, please. You may need to introduce yourself, and then I'll call on you in the next.
Thank you very much. My name is Yoko Watanabe. I head the JF Small Grants Program managed by UNDP here. So we have 22,000 projects. Any given time, there's 4,000 projects, which is up to $50,000, which is really to accelerate innovation in global environmental issues and also test out and so that it can be scaled up in UNDP and elsewhere. So I'm really seeing that this is a great opportunity to see how we can work together, and that we have basically a global platform, a knowledge platform, which has tools and approaches and lessons learned in the database. And we're also revamping the database ourselves. So as you have invited us, so I'm trying to see how can we meaningfully work together and use the lessons as well as the solutions that we have come up with. And as you are seeing, you are trying to make it very quickly to see solutions that are applicable to others, and that's what Small Grants is all about. We try to accelerate projects in 3 months or so and start and finish in a year or 2. So just a quick question to see what are the mechanisms to work together and how you see sort of these existing sort of knowledge to be linked up with this.
Thank you, Yoko. I think we'll take maybe another question or so. I think, Owen, you had your hand up, or anyone else? Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I think this is a great initiative. Just one question. Perhaps also JD can help respond. What is the link or the relationship between the Accelerator Labs and the project catalyst? How do the two feed each other?
Thank you, Owen. I see a hand up. Sarah.
Hi, Sarah Brenner, Sustainable Development Cluster. Thank you very much for this. It's a great initiative. I've often thought, why are we not looking for innovations from the ground up scale? And I think it's a missing element of governance, essentially. But I'm just kind of curious how you would define or put boundaries around frontier challenges, because I see the relevance of the three solutions that you've mentioned here for a great deal. I mean, ideally, these would be parts of what would be how you go about programming, right? So in my work in inequalities, there's a great range of initiatives, and understanding what's on the ground and what works, experimenting with solutions and using innovative data sources and evidence and solutions are part of the course. I mean, it should be how we do things. So I'm just, what goes in and what doesn't, and where are the boundaries, essentially?
Thank you, Sarah. Do you want to?
Hi, my name is Alberto, working in knowledge management. I would like to know more of how the programs and projects in UNDP, the more traditional ones, can actually learn from what the labs will discover, so to speak. So how do we learn from this mechanism?
I think you probably take this forward, if that's okay. And then we'll go to the next round of questions then.
Great. Okay. Let's maybe start with Sarah's question. So basically, your question is sort of why only frontier challenges, right? Right. And what is the characteristic around that? So this is this is terms we're sort of playing with. Basically, the ask of country offices right now is to focus a little bit their what they want the labs to focus on, right? So what we've told them are that our problems that are often, as we've talked about here, intergenerational, cross-border, they may have to do with exponential changes in technology and the sort of buildup of unsolved challenges like climate change and how that's sort of accelerating and getting worse. They may be all those, but we're trying to sort of use this as a tool to narrow down what the Accelerator Labs are focusing on for now, so that we can get enough breadth of diversity of approaches to solve that one issue. If you see what I mean. I don't know, Millie, if you wanna pick up on that, but it's that's what we're using for right now. In our initial calls with the country offices, we'd say, here's the chart, here's current programming, and here's the crazy environment, right? Changing and uncertain and dynamic. What do you think? How do you want to position UNDP in the next few years? And we got a wide range of program portfolio options. So you're right. The hope is that this does graft onto the way of doing programming across the board, whether it's a frontier challenge or a good old-fashioned stuck wicked problem from many years ago. But we just wanted to narrow in now so that we're able to have a practical conversation.
Yeah. Do you mind if I take one before? Because I'm
Yes,
going to run in a
please.
minute.
Yeah.
Sorry, colleague. Apologies in advance. I'm going to have to run away in 5 minutes. So it's not because I don't want to answer your question, but because I'm going to go to another meeting I'm late for. Just quickly, Owen, you asked specifically on the link. And funny enough, when you first started asking your question about the link, in my head, I expected you were going to say, what's the link between this and the GPN? And then you went Project Catalyst, kind of threw me off. But let me try and actually answer all three, because in a sense, that is a big question for us to answer. What's the logic behind all these different things that are moving at the same time in different places?
Thank you. Platforms to that.
I'd much rather not, but I will touch on that if I can. So, the immediate question, link between the Accelerator Labs and Project Catalyst. Catalyst was set up as a very small little pilot to see whether we can use some existing capacity that's not UNDP to scan the horizon and try and find new interesting initiatives that we can build on. So Catalyst is tiny. Catalyst is basically 3 staff with an external network of partners, resource people they work with that are scanning well outside UNDP to say what's happening out there is of relevance to us, and looking back into UNDP, do we have pieces in different parts of the organization that we can pull together to be able to develop new initiatives? So if you've seen, if you're following some of the work that they've been doing out of the Catalyst team, there was a strong sense in the external world, and this is something you're very familiar with, that we need to come up with fundamentally different approaches to how we deal with migration, and increasingly moving beyond a notion of migrants as temporarily stateless people to potentially a world where you're looking at statelessness becoming almost a long-term issue. So that came out of the external scan, and then looking internally, we saw that there was work being done by Mo and the team out of Addis, some of the work that the Istanbul team were doing in Turkey, etc., that were dealing with pieces of this. And so the Catalyst team helped to pull that together, connect that with some of the external partners to try and build a slightly bigger initiative strategy around how to deal with that. So that's kind of the whole idea of Catalyst. It's small, and it's meant to kind of range outside, and then look inside and see whether we can start pulling together pieces that may not immediately have been talking to you. Accelerator Labs are meant to be very much local level grounded. So built within country offices and built as a capacity within country offices to better connect into solutions, signals, data, partnerships that are happening at the local level that very often are existing traditional partnerships at the country level don't. I think Millie alluded to this a little bit. Generally speaking, if you look at our country offices, our programs, our partnerships, they tend to be very strong on the policy and government space, somewhat strong on private sector, civil society, except in a couple of cases, and Yoko, I'm glad you mentioned the SGP, except in a couple of cases, maybe not always very grounded in real local community, sort of bottom of the pyramid type space. The idea with these labs is to bring people in with the capacity and the mandate to really dive into those spaces. Find local innovators, lead users, deviants, the local system, working interesting things at the local level. And I will finish by answering the question you didn't ask, which is, so how does all of this fit into everything we've been talking about in this room over many hours in the past year on the GPN, etc. Very simple, I'm oversimplifying here, I'll touch the platforms of this. When we started the work on the GPN and the rethinking of our policy offer, we were really talking about how we rethink what we're doing from the top down. What our global platform is, how we rethink the way we connect across countries, across hubs, across country offices. The problem there, and we all know this perfectly well, is if we were to assume that top-down change was the only approach, we'd all be retired before this actually hit the ground at the day-to-day level of the country office. Even now with the GPN work, there's already a little bit of a narrative going, well, it's great you guys are looking at this at the global and regional level and with policy advisors. So when is country office going to change? So the idea a little bit strategically with the labs is we're doing this top down, we need to also then start building capacity from bottom up with groups of people, systems, capacities that think differently that ultimately can connect it. Yeah, so Catalyst looking outwards, GPN working on our global structures and capacities down to the regional and country level, the labs at the country level building stuff up. Very quickly, platforms. One thing to be very clear about is these labs are not meant to be substitutes for an answer to the platform question. The idea with the country platforms is we also recognize that in the toolkit of approaches we need to be able to use at the country level, we need stuff that goes beyond individual projects or portfolios. We need the capacity to be able to leverage large partnerships. So the whole piece of work around building capacities to set up platforms, and there are people in the room here who know that better than I do, so feel free to jump in and help me out here. The idea there is to give our country offices the capacity to also deal with problems where you need to mobilize large, diverse partners, to be able to attract transactions onto a platform rather than manage to a steering committee, a group of other stakeholders, and to use that where that's necessary. So all of these are the idea that what you want to put out there is a range of solutions, pilots, ideas that hopefully at different levels of the organization can start changing the way we work, make it a little bit more relevant to what's going on and try to address that relevance gap that we really talked about. I'm going to stop there. Sorry, went on a bit long.
Maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very quickly, just a second.
Sure.
I think it would be very good to have, I don't know, a diagram, a write-down that says exactly what you say.
Yes.
Because otherwise, when somebody hears about all these things, I mean, sometimes you cannot connect them. But the way you have articulated that really makes sense.
Listen, the biggest problem, I would say honestly, that we feel at the moment, again, in our team working on all this is, for some reason, internal communications in UNDP just sucks. Our ability to be able to pin this down into communications, messages, diagrams, etc., that permeate the organization, for some reason, it's just not working. And by the way, if anybody has an answer on how to deal with that, please comment out. So the thing is, this gets communicated, and I'm not accusing anybody here of lack of attention. I mean, this gets communicated in different pieces. We know we need to be able to communicate the whole much better. As you know, the administrator is very good at making that connection when you're asking the question. But when we try to translate that into emails or briefings or PowerPoint, somehow or other we never quite get it right. And so it's bad enough here because you guys at least can, stop me on the street and chat, and change messages on Facebook as we do. But we're very conscious when you get down to the country office level, most people are looking at this like, aliens flying over their heads. And we genuinely know there's a problem there in terms of how we connect all this and articulate it. Week after next, we've got the induction for the new res reps in Bonn. And what we're trying to do is say, for that at least, whether we can start putting a package together that ties all these pieces together. And then hopefully from there, we can start rolling it out to the rest. But yeah, you're absolutely right on that part. It should be easy. So that point, the light bulb went off. We should be able to communicate this better than we are at the moment because it's not hyper complicated.
Maybe just to jump in and answer the question about, how do we integrate, how does what Accelerator Labs do impact what the country offices do, right? So I think the risk here is that Accelerator Labs become those delivery units, that they become this sort of niche boutique consultancy that we have somewhere in the market. If this is successful, right? So Gina talked about 3 different ways in which we're making a bet we can close the relevance gap. Exploration, looking out, what are the emerging trends, who are the people coming up with disruptive ideas, being able to learn faster about the portfolio of experiments, local solutions. If this is successful, the way country offices design projects, develop CPDs, fundamentally changes by internalizing that. So there's a red line where we say, if I'm a rep, do not come to me with a concept proposal if you have not gone out and found at least 3 people who have found the solution to the problem that you're trying to solve. So we as a UNDP can play an interface between them and informing a big policy issue. Do not come to me before you have identified 5 sort of mutants, 5 organizations out there who are looking at this very differently. And this is something that we need to be, so this is the organizational change side of this, where the bet that we're making is, we have 60 ethnographers, 60 heads of exploration. See, we have 180 entirely new types of staff, where 3 years from now, the question becomes, do we need to have more of these capabilities inside the organization, for example?
Thanks.
Did you want to add something to the learning question?
So it's, what's frame the learning question again?
Alberto.
Yeah, sorry. It's the question was that how traditional officers learn from these labs. I think it goes back to the collective intelligence bit. Basically, that plays at multiple levels, and I won't get into too much details. But the way Gina explained it, it's almost like using that as an instrument to learn more about reality. But another level is also how you become smarter as a much wider collective. So the plan is in that sense to use collective intelligence or the principles behind that at these 2 levels. One is to kind of better understand how this reality works, but also how we share these kind of insights, solutions, tools, and so on. But still, it's the kind of learning as the key verb of all of this. And there's a host of instruments that you can use. The most obvious one is, let's say, kind of an online database where you can find stuff. But collective intelligence is not just about technology, it's also very much about the people. So whether that be gatherings or assemblies, there are different ways of how you might share and distribute that kind of knowledge.
Thank you. So I'm going to look around the room and we have a few more questions. Let me take 3. I think I'll have Adele and Charu. I may not get the order right, and then we'll come to you in a minute. Elsa, right? So Adele, please. And I'll have a question myself.
Thank you. I'm Adele from Vera, and thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I'd like to understand it a little bit more in detail. So what about the key performance indicators? How do you measure success? How do you measure failure? How do you define what works, what doesn't work? So just that I get a feeling, what exactly are we talking about? You take the 6 UNDP signature solutions as maybe they don't work, or are they out of scope and you say they work for sure, but we're looking at something else. So just, I don't know, maybe have some examples, what country offices are dealing with, what they want to tackle. What about the timeline? Because you mentioned the time pressure, we're not learning fast enough, so when do you expect results? Do you expect anything to change or to have a new solution? How many problems do you expect a country office to take up? Just one, is that enough? 2, 3, 4? So if you have a little bit more about figures and data about this, I think this would be very helpful. Thank you.
Hi, this is Charu from the Sustainable Development Cluster. It's kind of related to Adele's. A little bit more information on the labs, and thanks for having this wide DBL for us because there was a lot of questions we had too. What are some of the assumptions that the labs have on the country offices in terms of the existing knowledge that they have? I heard that these labs are basically going to do more testing, and labs are not going to develop. It's going to be more of a testing phase again. And UNDP sits on a lot of pilot tests and a lot of knowledge and a lot of projects that we've continuously done. So the hope with the Accelerator Labs is it's going to be something that's going to change in the systems, right? And if we're linking that with frontier technologies or policies, I think that's what I hear is the focus of the Accelerator Labs. Then how is that linked to some of the assumptions you may have already that exist on the country offices? And second is also our UNDP systems, capacities, what are the next steps forward for our own HR and systems and all the rest, or the existing staff that we have.
I'm Oksana Leshenko, Crisis Bureau. First time introduce myself this way. My question is on MOPS, because the labs initiatives is UNDP author, right? And the MOPS, of course, was interagency work. But in that, letter A stood for accelerator. And in many missions that took place as MOPS missions, the accelerators were identified and the governments accepted those accelerators. So I'm just wondering how this will play with the accelerator labs now when we go to the countries. These accelerator labs, if I understand correctly, they not necessarily will be focusing on those accelerators that were identified by MOPS. These may be different issues they will be tackling it, but how are we going to tackle this with the governments? Let's say if we come and say, this is Accelerator Lab, well, we have to explain that, how this relates to that accelerator that the mission identified. Have you thought about that?
Thank you. Do you want to take these?
Sure. Jump in. These are hard.
These are the hard questions.
Okay, so on KPIs, there is a monitoring framework for this that was circulated in the interbureau pack. I think it might not have made it all the way, through to everyone. So there's been some thinking on how to. We're trying to balance here, right? The flexibility of doing something that really just hasn't been done before, right? With the accountability that setting key performance indicators brings you, right? So I think we're gonna build on a lot of the work that Malika and Ben and Bernardo and team did in terms of innovation metrics across UNDP through the results-oriented annual report, et cetera. But in general, so this is like kind of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to scale innovation in the organization. It's really surprising to speak to someone like the administrator who's as serious, as anxious to do this now throughout the organization, right? As much as there is across the UN extraordinary support for it, this is real and it's granular, and there's funding behind it, which is quite serious. So the focus here is really taking that journey that Millie talked about, right, where it had flying under the radar, lots of planes in the air, building the landing strip, taking that to the next level and having a network of airports, right? So we're really talking about scaling here. And when we talk about scaling, the ways of measurement that we're talking are basically on 3 levels. Influencing UNDP,
right? And the core business of UNDP, influencing government and policy, right? And influencing sort of access to markets for a lot of the people solving their own problems, the kinds of collective intelligence, how that connects up to the broader market and policy world. So that's sort of the broad stroke, how we measure success on scaling, right? But just impacting UNDP is already giant, right? Because we're creating, not because we're internally focused, hopefully, but because we're creating a capability that we can then, in a way, export as a service line to governments who are dealing with the same challenges, right? So maybe just then to shift into a little bit, Charu, your question, unless anybody wants to add anything about that, KPIs? No, okay, go ahead.
No, but I think partially answered. So just to give you a couple of examples, what's coming out from our countries in an effort to try to answer that. Right, so we have one country that's saying, it's a question of fit between what we have versus what we're being asked to solve. We have Fiji, where the rep is saying, we've got nothing to say about what does the justice system look like for a family who's having to relocate from their home because of something that a family in another country has done. And by the way, no one else has an answer to that. So is this the place they would like to play in this space? This isn't something that we're going to do in a 6 to 8 week experiment, right? So what is this isn't something that can be log framed. So what does the process by which we start answering this question look like? Another country that shall not be named, the issue that they brought up is a neighboring country is delegitimizing the entire international development effort as funding terrorism. Which signature solution does that fit in, right? But it's a fundamental issue that is breaking the trust and governance between the international sector, the citizens, the government, and the neighboring geopolitical dimensions, right? The third one was a country from Eurasia. It's a fourth country in the world, a country that has the fourth largest cohort of citizens playing in the digital economy sector. Completely unintelligible to the state, right? There is no sense of how much money citizens are making, what is being taxed. It's not a tax. What does it mean for the inequality? The government is blind to this growing economic sector. All of these areas are places where there isn't anybody else playing, and it's an opportunity for us. The Facebook bit, we have 3 or 4 countries who are saying, we don't, these 7,500 people, they don't even sit in our country. So who is liable for the decisions that they make that we know lead to Sri Lanka, that we know leads to violence? How do we engage with them? Right? So as of now, we don't have an answer as to how do you do that. Our intuition is that these 3 responses might be a start of how we do that, right? But we simply, these are the sticky issues for which, if you compare them to the portfolios that we have, it's like throwing a slime at a dragon. And it's not doing anything. We can pretend, we can write a fancy report that says thousands of women have been trained to, basket weaving, and we've given grants to 1 million SMEs. It's not solving these issues. That's not a fit. That's why learning is the key thing. And I mean, for us, learning has a bit of a bad connotation, right? You think of learning and think of LMS and taking mandatory courses. This is something very different for us, right?
Let's move on to Charu's question. Yoko, I just wanted to note that your point is well taken. I think we should have a granular discussion about the small grants program and figure out what to do. I think some of it might be how to connect and how to get some momentum behind both of our work. I think some of it might be finding a way to sort of keep a better handle on that intelligence that we get from the small scale solutions. And the other big challenge we have is connecting that to the systems level change. So maybe we can have a conversation just on more granularly on how to do that. Charu, I think your question on what are our assumptions about country offices. So you talked about this kind of like pilot-itis, right? Where we pilot a lot, not necessarily because we're even really testing it, more because maybe we didn't have the money to do it or convince everybody we needed to do fully. In the portfolio of experiments, one of the techniques we're trying to work on, and they're working on this heavily in Asia, so right now Cambodia and Bangladesh, is a sort of capability for what's called sense making, right? Which part of it is seeing what you already have and what you're already doing, right? And understanding how that relates to this exponential change on the outside, right? So it's not always necessarily about starting something new. It may be about reorienting what's already done, connecting it among itself, right? Finding different partners, et cetera. So just to say that the emphasis of language on testing and prototyping, we hope will not lead us down to more, more pilots everywhere, right? to continue the airport metaphor, right? We'll keep with the pilots. And then you talked about the systems. I just want to pick up on that as well. This is exactly right. So we were talking about this a little bit this morning, right? Where I think we're quite aware that some of the process innovation that's going to come out of this is a deliverable in itself, is a result in itself, right? So this recruitment process is the first example of which, right? Hiring those kinds of capabilities, heads of exploration, experimentation, and solutions mapping, right, is new for us. Hiring them in Togo and Chad and Laos and Ecuador is it's going to be this incredibly amazing experience. I'm sure many mistakes will be made and we'll learn many things along the way. We definitely want to pay enough attention to that, to look at HR, human resources and what it's like to apply for a job with UNDP, right? How you get talent to come to our website, right? What channels do you do? We're looking at really creative means of kind of finding where the conversation is. Not necessarily Cambridge Analytica, but do you see me to see where the innovators are and really kind of attract a different kind of capability. So that kind of grafting back onto the human resources, legal, procurement, finance of the organization is critical. And this will be our first test with the human resources. Maybe Oksana. So the maps for those who are outside UNDP are the mainstreaming, accelerating, and policy support modality by which we begin work with governments on the Sustainable Development Goals. So once the mainstreaming international development planning is done, there's a bottleneck identification exercise to identify the accelerators. I think this is a great point. And we definitely need to build on that at the country level. So if they've already identified policy accelerators, right? I think normally what happens, but I've been a little bit out of UNDP for a while, so I may be wrong. But I think what normally happens is the accelerators that are identified in the MAPS process are these kind of cross-ministerial, it's nobody's job, multi-dimensional collaboration problems, right? Or they're related to incentives, or there's something there that sort of needs a tweak or a complete overhaul. So I would guess, this is a guess at this point, but let's work this through, that the labs would take that and make it much more granular and find different approaches, as we're talking about this portfolio of experiments, right, to actually accelerate the same thing that we determined needed to be accelerated, right? So not to say like, to actually narrow a bit, but more approaches on that same thing that was identified in the government.
I mean, chances are that in many of these countries, the starting point will be some of those accelerators. And then looking what are the dynamics around it and comparing it with what we have to respond to them. And hopefully labs are supposed to add to that portfolio. Yes. At least in the discussions with them, that has been the starting point. Yes, those countries that have had MAPS missions already.
Thank you. This is a lot of interesting questions. Let's take a couple more. I think we have time, a little more time to go on, so thank you. I'll take Malika, and then I'll take you, and then I'll have a question myself. And Jessica as well. Yeah. Oh.
Thank you so much for this. Well, we've been looking forward to it. Thank you for the breakdown. I had 3 questions.
Just one.
Just they're all
We'll take them on, we'll only answer one.
Answer your favorite, that's no problem. So the first is, as you move forward, this is the GPN, this is where policy support, global policy support for the country offices. So how do we support the 60 labs? If they, across the different thematic groups, how can we get them where they need to be as they are taking on this difficult time crunched challenge? So where do you see our role in plugging in and supporting you? The second question is whether you already had set out certain types of criteria, because you're building this wonderful network of labs, and like you have UCO, you have a lot of other country and global teams that have wonderful portfolios and pilots. So how do we upscale our pilots and add on to this network so that we're growing together as a network? And do you have a set of criteria that we could start screening our portfolio with to identify some of these lead users as well? So as you learn, how can we adapt and learn as well in an accelerated way? I'll leave it to you, questions.
Sure, and this is a very similar question to what how you use it in direct response to the screen that we're looking at now. My name is Jessica, representative of the gender team. I'm working on a global project which is very much aligned with the portfolio experiments. You know, we call it a different name, and so what I'm looking to, you know, how do we continue this conversation? Because we have both experience right now, so I think there's both a lot that we can share and bring, but a lot that we can also learn. So functionally, the cross fertilization and the cross learning that's happening, because we've dipped our toe into how to bring technical and substantial expertise and really to be developing monitoring frameworks that and evaluation frameworks that are more focused on process and learning. And you know, the theory of change is more of like a circuit and a Venn diagram, a lot of frames. So I think that there's a lot more that we can share. So looking again for like those mechanisms in which we can do so. And I think this is true not only of, you know, global project I'm working on, but more generally, you know, at HQ.
Thank you, then you, sir.
Alejandro Pacheco, Latin American Caribbean. So first of all, congratulations, this is a great job. It looks amazing and so quickly, so very exciting and very excited to be here. In that line, and I think many of the questions and answers go along this line, there's been a lot of innovation within UNDP, mainly on the margins, right? And it was more of a good manager, someone who wanted to do it, an opportunity, and now it's mainstream. So as you said, it's one in a lifetime opportunity. I have kind of a, I don't know if it's a concern, but something that I would like to share, which is what you have there, as you're saying, it's an amazing opportunity. How do you make sure that country offices to take full advantage of that, right? And when I mean this, I mean I can't think of a country office where you have these hopefully brilliant people who are doing this amazing job. How do you ensure that that's not disconnected from the rest of the country offices and they don't look at this aliens has nothing to do with us, and then you have kind of citizens A and citizen B type of category. And I think as you are thinking of how to find the best solutions, you should also maybe consider a little bit how do you integrate the country office into internalizing these solutions and being part of it. And I think there is a process that I'm not to make a standard operation procedure, but some kind of thinking along the lines on how you actually make country office embrace this new way of working. And a concern would be, you know, with these all these examples you have with the airplanes and you know, when you think of a low cost and a new company that is trying to compete in the low cost of air flights, they don't buy their own planes, right? They don't make upfront huge investment in infrastructure. They actually rent some of the planes that other people have. And these amazing resources that you have, seems like a big chunk of it is going into infrastructure, to hiring 60 whole teams along the world, right? So how is it a savvy decision, or could it be maybe thought a little bit more in terms of how to use that money for investment?
Thank you. Those are three very good questions in their own right. Do you want to take these?
Sure. Sure. Okay, maybe let's start from the end there. So why are we not renting our capabilities, right? Why are we not procuring? Honestly, I would say that's what UNDP's been doing for a while, right? Very, you know, like small teams punching above their weight, right? As you say, this sort of like people, early adopters who believe, you know, and who
who have managers who will take a risk. And so, again, we're very conscious of this like moment in time with an administrator like we have who's ready to do this seriously. Hiring more international consultants or even service contracts at the country level would be a missed opportunity, right? This is an opportunity to invest in capability, and if the assumption and the theory is right, then UNDP starts to have a totally different kind of capability that evolves over time on the ground, and links up these strange titles, head of experimentation with head of governance portfolio. Right, and we really start to make that link that I think Jessica has some insight on for us. So I mean that was our decision making there on that one.
Not that I'd like to take a lot of time on this, right? But there are more options of that. You could have consultants, you could have your own staff, or you could also have money that you invest into the solutions themselves. I mean, the example of the pancreas, you could have a company that goes into that, and this is pancreas, and this is the US, and whatever. Or you can find yourself in Haiti with an amazing solution that no one is investing yet to it. Is it a wise decision to have people going through these decisions, or could you have some of that money, maybe less labs, and have more money to invest into those solutions? When I mean renting, I mean investing into the solutions rather than.
No, just to say again, so we're focusing now on recruitment of the lab teams because we're going from 0 to 60, literally, right? Yeah, exactly. So right now, that's our focus. That's not the only scope of the work, right? The labs will have experiment budgets. We'll be setting up global level partnerships with groups like Lego, who has like a serious lead user strategy, and like actually see these adult users of Lego as like part of their design team. MIT, Nesta, and others. So that's definitely part of the story. But we did feel investing in capability would work, and a national capability was working at this point. Let's where should we go now? Maybe so on the GPN. Again, I think there's a lot to be learned, and there are a lot of groups that have a lot to offer. Maybe one way to structure this would be to and tell me if this is crazy, because really I'm coming back into UNDP after a long time kind of out. So I don't know the conversations you've had, but I would think if we could kind of target our learning a little bit and set like specific learning questions, like if you want to reinvent results-based management, I'm with you there. Like I will put personal time into that, right? If the question is, how do you sort of keep the accountability while having this more circuit Venn diagram, circles, not boxes type monitoring of results, maybe that's the learning question, right? If it's a more specific question about like what governance in the 21st century looks like, let's make that one of our learning questions. But I think maybe that might be the best way is to sort of identify those, take our cue from the country offices, see what's coming up, come back for their homework when they think about this question we asked them, which is what's the development issue that's changing so quickly that your program feels like it can't keep up, right? That's the question we asked them. So we take our cue from them, and maybe based on the substantive expertise here, we sort of zone in on some learning questions would be my suggestion. I think that was it, yeah? I think we made the rounds. Anybody?
Thanks. We may have another couple of questions. I wanted to say, just on this last note that you raised, Gina, I think one of the main things going forward, it'll be for us in GPN and for you guys, to really find those the shared ground and the existing tools and systems and instruments are in place that can make a difference in terms of getting to the sort of success outcome picture that you want. I can think of some of the entry points are quite granular, quite practical. There's a lot of work being done on the learning side. Just along the lines you mentioned about the circularity of that learning. The recent PPM is all about that. It's about embedding learning as part of your programming cycle so that it doesn't end up being this mechanical approach to RPM. You do need platforms to enable that. You need to have ways to capture some of that, some of the learning. There's some work that's being done on that. Some of it is tentative, some of it is more advanced. And some of it really looks outside, just like you were saying. Think of the work we do with the Global Delivery Initiative of the World Bank. Some of you may be familiar with it. We're pulling resources, data of all kinds, using artificial intelligence to sift through data and train our own algorithms to go through this data so that we can come to a global perspective on what the chief delivery challenges are for a development organization or for a government. And I think all of these, if you will, experiments need to be connected. And I like to think that the network of labs is potentially a great connector of all that. It's also a great, I think, user of some of these important points. The third point I had in mind is we're about to relaunch, if you will, the communities of practice. It's an old concept, but there's a lot of emphasis in GPN, and I think you'll hear some of that on February 4th in Bonn, as we heard from JP. On the communities of practice, it'll be, I think, fundamental that from early on, as you build up this team, we build that strong connection between that internal attempt to have a viable conversation on how to move the needle on some of the issues and how to identify the expertise and the experts that you find, the experiment leads that you have in these 60 offices are brought into that. I think that's really our challenge for us all. I don't think we should be looking at Gene and say, oh, you need to do all this. I think this is a call to action for us all to continue to be on your case, so to speak, to be really up there and say, we're also here to support. There are investments, there is a structure here. And ultimately, that's where it needs to go back to, because it's about your work is about making that entire structure more effective going forward. We also have, on a more trivial level, mechanisms like the HQ pack for country program documents. If we don't benefit from the views of the experiment lead, of the practitioners in the labs, at the time when these country program documents were drafted and country program quality assurance, well, we stand no chance of changing some of their discourse. So I think going forward, we should go to the OPG and say, from now on, we want the representatives of the labs on each one of these packs so that they can immediately double check and verify that connection is actually working. Because at the end of the day, it's about finding these practical hooks that give us a chance for this to stick. Otherwise, there's always a risk of having parallel networks of all kinds. I think that's a real challenge. And my last question was, how did you pick 60? How did you go about, what work was it about the political economy of a specific place, simply the interest that you found? I'm quite curious to that. Or, is it the RR raising her hand and saying, I'd love to be part of this? And, it's a very practical question.
These are great points, thank you.
No, sure.
Really, really good start, really great ideas. On how we pick the countries, do you wanna?
Sure. So we talked, bureaus pick the countries.
Okay, good. So it'll be random.
Yeah, so it was
Random
called, we wanted to make sure that there's a really strong
Excellent.
ownership from the regional bureaus. Some of the criteria that we suggested was strong management, which is a bit tricky in a context where we're getting all of the reps in. A strength of the country office team, diversity in terms of income levels and development, mix of conflict, post-conflict, and the binding constraint that we have had in terms of geographical spread was half of them need to be in Africa.
Of course,
The continent, not the
no, absolutely.
bureau. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Which was creative math for a little while there.
Thank you, man. That makes sense. Let me see if there's a last round, maybe, since we have a few more minutes for those of you who are behind. Any other issues? It's a lot of food for thought. And certainly, I saw the map flashing with all the different countries. If that's something that can be shared, is public for public consumption within UNDP, do let me know. And then we can have a quick.
I mean, the list of countries,
The
you
list
have
of
to eyeball them.
Right.
Yeah.
Although we enjoy doing that. But,
Squint.
I think that's good. So particularly if you look, forward planning, there's a CPD coming down the pike, say June. It'd be good to see to what extent does the narrative of the CPD reflect the aspiration of turning things around through that country experience in the localized context. So for us to also plan around that. Did we have any other? We've exhausted our random questions.
There's a next question.
Great. Yes.
Just read it out loud.
Better late than never. Thank you. Do you want to read it out loud? That's very kind. Thank you.
Taking the example of the pancreas, how will the Accelerator Labs address the regulatory barriers that might be preventing many locally / users developed solutions from becoming mainstream?
Okay, nice. Regulatory question.
The regulatory
Labs
framework.
help the regulatory framework.
So this is a constraint in the US, so luckily no labs in the US, so we don't have that, just joking, constraint. But I think a lot of it comes in, first of all, being aware of those kinds of innovations, right? Mapping the current regulatory framework and figuring out a lot of that maybe, I think we really need to, I'm looking forward to actually talking to Dana next week in this solutions mapping webinar on Thursday at 8 a.m. And
Is that an open center for
Absolutely,
everyone? I think
yeah.
I'd love to see the
Absolutely.
invite. Would
I
certainly
think
be-
we're gonna do it this time with the 60 labs. We might also book her again with the conversation with the administrator.
Oh, right,
So at a broader level. But I'm really interested to talk to her because I think it's really important for us to look at sort of what people like her want in the first place, right? We can imagine there are like intellectual property help we can give people like that. We can imagine maybe there are changes to the regulatory framework that need to be made. But honestly, I don't think much of that means anything until we start viewing these lead users as human beings with lives who are already like solving problems and putting a lot into it. So I think that's something we need to figure out and learn with them.
And just to add that OECD just last month added this component as a way to measure government innovation efforts. So what we're doing here is trying to create that interface between the Danas of the world and the systemic change, right? What the theory tells us is that lead users don't necessarily have an incentive to run a business with what they do. They don't have an incentive to scale or mainstream their own solution. They're solving primarily their own problem. They live in conditions of extremes. So the bet that we're making is that we as UNDP can play that role as an interface between them and the systemic change. In the case of Dana, there are thousands of people who are using her bionic pancreas, generating more data than any other clinical trial that FDA has run in the US on that topic. So single-handedly, open source, she's got more data than any other clinical trial. Right? It so happens that there isn't an organization who is capable of stepping in and playing that interface role. This is what we would like to play in the 60 countries.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.
Thank you. Well, thank